Sorry.
Okay, if I can welcome everyone to our discussion today of the relationship of economic reform and productivity to democratic transition. My name is Carl Gershman, and I'm the president of the NED. This is a very important issue that does not get enough attention, in my view, in the so-called democracy promotion community, which understandably tends to focus on political reform, strengthening civil society and independent media, and defending human rights. NED has paid a lot of attention to this question, in part because two of its four core institutes, the Center for International Private Enterprise and the Solidarity Center, focus on issues like regulatory reform and property rights, removing barriers to entrepreneurship, and promoting worker rights and freedom of association that are intimately connected to our subject today. And while the NED is primarily a grant-making organization, we also have a research institute called the International Forum for Democratic Studies, which is now under the very able leadership of Chris Walker, that examines in depth the complexities and deficits of democracy in different contexts and how democratic transition is affected by many factors, economic performance being among the most important. Today's event is the first of a series of planned meetings on this topic. In the coming months, we intend to hold sessions on specific country cases in order to drill down a bit more deeply on the issue of economic reform and political transition in new and fragile democracies. And I want to extend my thanks to the Legatum Institute and its president, Jeff Gedman, my good friend, for partnering with NED and supporting this important initiative. We greatly look forward to working with Jeff and his team on this in the months ahead. I also want to thank our other co-sponsors today, the Democracy Lab, which is a joint project of the Legatum Institute and Foreign Policy Magazine that provides a unique outlet for journalists covering the struggles of democratic transition, and the journal World Affairs that publishes important think pieces on U.S. foreign policy with a special emphasis on democracy. We're joined today by Christian Carroll, who directs the Democracy Lab at Foreign Policy, and by Jim Denton, who edits World Affairs. I also want to note the presence today of Ambassador Zalbay Khalilzad, who's a member of the NED board and who leads the board's oversight of our programs in the broader Middle East region. Finally, if you want to follow this event on Twitter and contribute to the conversation, you can use the hashtag NEDEvents or follow the endowment at any democracy, period. And now I come to my main function today, which is to introduce Anne Applebaum, who will in turn introduce our speaker, Ashraf Ghani, and also moderate our discussion. I regret very much that Anne and I missed each other last November when I was in London speaking at Legatum and she was in Washington, where she spoke here at NED, among other places, about her new book, Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956. The word crushing in the title of this book, like the book itself, is pure Anne. She doesn't beat around the bush with euphemisms, but gets right to the point with language that is clear and compelling and historically accurate. Like her Pulitzer Prize-winning history of the Soviet Gulag, Iron Curtain is a monumental work of scholarship and truth-telling about Stalinist crimes which for too long have been enveloped in a dense intellectual fog of ignorance, ideology, and morally repugnant apologetics. By seeing through this fog and describing with immense and brilliantly assembled documentation the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe, and conveys a message about the origins of the Cold War and the struggle for freedom that resonates in today's world when the United States faces new dangers that it cannot ignore and must try as best it can to understand. This is the work of an important and courageous public intellectual, which is why I am so proud to welcome Anne Applebaum to the NED today and to invite her to introduce our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carl, for that really very, very kind introduction. In fact, I am more than delighted to be here at NED again. This has long been one of my favorite Washington institutions, and I'm delighted to have been introduced by Carl, who is one of my favorite Washington public intellectuals, and I'm delighted now to introduce you to Dr. Ashraf Ghani, who's long been one of my economic heroes. Thinking about this, Dr. Ghani, to me, is living evidence of what can happen to people and to careers and to individuals when impoverished and underdeveloped states begin to open up to the world, and what happens when they subsequently withdraw. He was born in 1949 in Logar province of Afghanistan. He was educated in Kabul, which I learned about 20 minutes ago. One of his classmates was Dr. Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad as well. He then studied at the American University in Beirut, and then during Afghanistan's liberal 1970s, he went back to Afghanistan to teach at Kabul University, where he would have become a leading force in Afghanistan's further development had it continued at that time. Instead, following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, much of his family was arrested. Afghanistan's window for development shut down for a quarter of a century. And Afghanistan lost the human capital represented by Dr. Ghani and by Ambassador Khalilzad and their colleagues. First terming in the U.S., he got a PhD at Columbia, taught at Johns Hopkins, and eventually worked for the World Bank. During his many years abroad, Dr. Ghani worked in Russia, China, and India, among other places, and became an expert in the theory and practice of large-scale economic change. In 2002, though, he finally got the opportunity to return to Afghanistan, and he became one of the authors of the Bonn Agreement, the process and the document which, in effect, created a new Afghan state where none had existed and a legitimate government where none had existed. He served as Afghanistan's finance minister between 2002 and 2004, instigating reforms of the treasury, customs, budget, and currency. He prepared Afghanistan's first national development framework, and he oversaw a $28 billion reconstruction program for the country. He and his extraordinary co-author, Claire Lockhart, who is also here, also wrote a brilliant book about what went wrong in Afghanistan. If you haven't read it, please go out and purchase Fixing Failed States, which helps explain why investment is better than aid, why money spent on foreign contractors is so often wasted, and why far more attention needs to be paid to the construction of state institutions in places like Afghanistan. Dr. Ghani wears many other hats, and he's won many awards, which I will list all of those today. He's here today largely because of the work that he and Claire Lockhart have been doing for the past several years at the Institute for State Effectiveness, which they founded, in particular the analysis of historical case studies of political and economic transition, through which they hope to look for lessons of the past to use in the present. At the Lugano Institute, I run a program on transitions which tries to do exactly this, to find relevant lessons, whether from economic reform in Poland or legal reform in Chile or transitional justice in South Africa, and to find innovative ways of using them in the present. A few months ago, I asked Dr. Ghani and Dr. Lockhart to write a paper on Syria, which was intended to do that as well. Since it was published, the Syria paper should be here, by the way, available. I don't know how many copies there are, but it's around, and it's also electronically available. But since it was published, I've had many people, including many Syrians, tell me that it's one of the few useful things they've read about the conflict. And this is not because it's written by Syria experts, because Dr. Ghani and Dr. Lockhart are not. It's because looking at the conflict from a comparative perspective and a historical perspective can sometimes give you unexpected insights. Today, as you've heard, Dr. Ghani's theme is a broader one, and it touches on a subject close to the hearts of many people in this room: how economic reforms, the critical element to the success of any democratic transition or radical change, are often forgotten by policymakers focused on politics. There's really no one better placed than he to discuss these matters, so thank you to Ned for hosting this, and thank you to Dr. Ghani for agreeing to come. Thank you.
Should be delighted with her editorial skills because she brings a level of sharpness. Jeff brings in all the encouragement in Legatum, and Anne brings that sharp focus that would improve any argument. So Claire and I are indeed. And it's wonderful to have my dear friend and colleague of decades, Ambassador Khalilzad, President Gershman, other colleagues. I see at the back Dr. Weinbaum, other friends. It's good to be among you. In the last 2 years, I've been doing two things. I've been leading the transition from international forces to Afghan forces, which has meant a very in-depth examination of the security sector. And on the sides, we've been looking at international transformations. When nights are really cold in Afghanistan, it is great to work on another country. But the relationship is organic because the last decade was dominated by every problem becoming a security problem. We've reached a point in time where the limits and utility of force are very clear. Force, his utility and legitimate use of force is going to be required. But every problem cannot be turned into a security problem or a use of force problem. This brings us to a juncture where we need to think through. I need to understand the workings of this. Oh, sorry. Is anybody here that can actually be? I was told not to touch one button, which was this one.
Try now.
No? No? It's frozen. Sorry. There, thank you. Why do we need to go to the fundamentals? Conflict and transition are both manifestations of failed politics. When there is political consensus, conflict is channeled through institutions that resolve it. Because conflict is characteristic of all societies, but it's destructive conflict that destroys institutions, and that is manifestation of failed politics. The success of peace and transitions critically depend on consensus building. The art of building consensus in the last decades is atrophied. And if we are going to reinvent statecraft, we need to understand why consensus holds societies and polities together. Democratic politics has a distinctive nature. Max Weber coined the notion of charisma to describe extraordinary leadership. What is distinctive about democratic politics is that charisma is transferred to the people. Charisma is invested in institutions, not in persons. And this, I think, marks a fundamental characteristic of democracy because recourse is back to a process to resolve the conflicts and able to set priorities through processes that can give a mandate. An authoritarian mandate is invocation of heaven. A democratic mandate is invocation of the will of the people. And that makes a world of difference. The other part that is equally significant is in the democratic politics, economic policy is part of the political consensus. It is not outside political consensus. And by bringing the economic dimension within the political consensus, implementation acquires, again, both legitimacy and reinforces legitimacy. When economic agendas are imposed from outside, they do not generate consensus. In terms of a balance sheet of democracy, again, I think it's worth noting that only democracies have developed middle classes. It is extremely rare for an autocratic system to produce a middle class. And it's been, again, the heritage of the progressive era in the United States and then turned into a global process after World War II that has given us solid middle classes, where elitism of the left or the right variety has been domesticated through large middle classes that have sustained the process of participation. So civil society discussion again connects to the emergence of this middle class. Because when we try to produce civil society from outside, it acquires other syndromes, other characteristics, both positive and negative. But when a civil society is embedded back within the functioning market economy, in a functioning democratic politics, the checks and balances are of a very different order. IEC, as Anne very kindly noticed, it launched a study on transitions to focus both on state building, market building, and peace building. We have a large series of cases, but what is distinctive is to look at history for patterns. History is usually studied as case studies, as individual cases, individual. What we have been trying to look is to discern patterns in lessons. No two cases are alike, but there are broad patterns that lead lessons from the past for the present and the future. Because the present, in any place, is a product of choices made in the past. And the present today, in any place, is a juncture regarding choices to be made and consequences to have had for the future. So it's in this reading of the patterns that we are interested. And I will spare you any discussion of pathologies of aid, because it will just annoy some of my friends and make me more enemies. Once I cut the Afghan security sector when Ambassador Khalilzad was ambassador in Afghanistan from a claimed 700,000 to 8,000, and they came to kill me, and told the president of Afghanistan that serious things could happen to me. And he turned back. President Karzai has an enormous sense of humor, and he said, if you want to kill Dr. Ghani, you have to take a number in a line. The number of people who are standing is very large. And the ambassador, of course, made sure that I stayed alive, part of. Though I don't know how pleased he was with the consequences. But let me highlight some things as characteristics, not in the way of criticism, but in the way of reading the patterns. One is that peace agreements are marked by absence of attention to economics. when you take, I've read all these peace agreements. Claire Lockhart and I wrote a long article in 2006 on classification of types of peace agreement. When international use of force, for instance, is involved in a peace agreement, the details are minute. But there's usually one paragraph or two on economics. Second, a significant outcome of peace in transitions have been criminalization of economy, informalization economy, and consolidation of grand corruption. Grand corruption was the term that was used in 18th century England because corruption held the elite together. And in a lot of post-conflict environments and transition environments, we've seen the emergence of grand corruption. Simultaneously, we've noted criminality and informality. What is informality? 4 billion people today around the world do not have solid property rights. 4 billion people do not have access to property rights. Because of it, a lot of urban investments turn into slum developments. It's not that there is shortage of land in the world. It is that the policy space to create property rights does not get to be focused on. Afghanistan's heroin trade is one of the most sophisticated value chain developments in the world. Afghanistan's agriculture, 65% of the legal production rots between the farm and the market. The criminal economy works with the speed of light and harnesses all aspects of globalization to its service. When it comes to legal economy, we fail. And if you're looking, when our friend Fukuyama proclaimed the end of history, relying on Hegel, there was a feeling that all alternatives to democracy had collapsed. But part of it was precisely the word collapse. They collapsed under their own weight, not because they were democratic movements like 19th century and early 20th century to consolidate democracy. And people thought the struggle was over. Now, looking 20 years after the event, for people like Anne and I who worked on Russia, we see the reemergence of authoritarian or semi-authoritarian. And if you worked in Russia, as I did, in 96, in Siberia, there was no money. Everything had reverted to barter. And the criminalization of the economy and the capture, privatization, not the legal privatization, but substantive privatization, brought such a disenchantment with democratic process that it legitimated authoritarians. So there are serious consequences to the failure to focus on the economic dimension. People, particularly when authoritarian regimes collapse, expect improvement of their lives. But what we have seen repeatedly is that democracy has been reduced to an election every 4 or 5 years where a new system of patronage is empowered. Substantive democracy building is not about elections. Elections are essential, but the democratic substantive part needs to be focused, and as part of that, we have to have the agenda. I want to highlight something for you that's to shift. You would not see this chart in any country assistance strategy by USAID, by World Bank, by Asian Development Bank, or by anyone else. I've reviewed all of them for a very long period. You know what it is? It is the agreed international framework called the national accounts. It is agriculture, mining, manufacturing, construction, wholesale, transport, other activities. Then it gives you total value added over times. Why is this important? We've been spending months now and we're doing large-scale statistical analysis of these because it's a totally measurable tool to say what difference does economic policy make, and it's measurable. And it is actually measured by international agreement, and the UN keeps the records. The IMF and the World Bank keep it too, but with the missing of this part. They don't include the construction sector. Now, why is it that not single one of these bilateral or multilateral development organizations uses the standard framework? Because it forces measurability. If one adopted this framework, then aid, resource allocation has to tie to outcomes and not to inputs. What we have turned the word of economic growth into is a word of projectized development, where the outsourcing of the government that began with Vice President Gore's initiative is gone so far that the principle in the agent problem has arisen very substantially. Now what we have largely in developmental organizations are contract managers, not economic experts. I'm sorry, I have not turned this on. Thank you. So it is important to understand that there is an agreed upon. This data goes back to 1970 for the whole world and for the Soviet Union to 1990, former Soviet Union to 1990. We can do all types of correlations, but more importantly, we can see lives. Because in a static 5-year picture, you see what percentage is in agriculture, how is it shifting. And there's a framework that says what is the net asset change that has occurred during any particular period. And the percentage of change of rate of growth, of course, means differences in opportunities. This is very purely at the level of why growth matters. We have a joke in Afghanistan. You know what's the most significant driver of GDP in Afghanistan? It's rain. There is no corruption attached, no conditionality, and it's totally pro-poor. Other than that, everything we find problematic. No, literally. Any year that rains in Afghanistan, if we have 3 good rains, rate of growth is 5 to 8% to 10% greater. Every year that it does not rain, the rate of growth is correspondingly reflected. But that is depending on nature. What we need now is a disciplined approach to produce growth first, and of course, most significantly, inclusive growth. Because they are different beyond these figures or numbers. Is it women who are the dominant players in agriculture? Is it the youth or others? But I'll come back to them. I've dealt with that. So now let me shift to something which is of great interest to Ned and to Lagatom and our other collaborators. How do we want to deal with entrepreneurship? I want to propose a framework and then illustrate it very quickly. Because I think there's been significant lack of clarity regarding entrepreneurship. The first unit regarding entrepreneurship is the individual. And what we find strikingly about individual level is that, with the exception of parts of Russia that were 70 years of authoritarianism really drained the energies out, at the individual level, you find entrepreneurial initiatives to be a worldwide phenomenon. India and China have amazing capabilities. Afghans or similar to Americans. Risk of failure does not deter any Afghan from starting 20 times. But the problem is the next level, the firm. When we go to firm formation, in a lot of countries, the level of entrepreneurship drops by a factor of 100 to 1,000-fold. You find very few firms that are entrepreneurial. Why? Because the enabling environment to make the firm entrepreneurial takes a functioning market. And a functioning or at least predictable system of governance to be able to make the firm function. And I can cite again from multiple parts of the world illustrations. The next level is a cluster. Porter from Harvard made an immense contribution to his notion of cluster, because cluster brings varieties of capital together and makes it location specific. Why universities in Massachusetts are critical to a cluster? Because that produces types of effect, or why Stanford is critical to the Silicon Valley. It's this relationship among a group of firms and a group of universities, government entities, media, that allows us to understand a firm, and understand a cluster in a specific location. So a cluster enables us, for instance, to compare Baghdad with Beirut. In Beirut, you'll find enormous clusters. In Baghdad, you'll find very few clusters, reinforcing sets of relationships and capabilities. But the strength and weakness of the cluster is a measurable phenomenon. It's not abstract. Because the minute we focus, for instance, on human capital, we see whether the underlying set of capabilities are being produced as a stock. Because again, when we've looked at training programs are usually short-term. They deal with a particular flow problem. They don't deal organically with producing a continuous stock. What the GI Bill of Rights did, which is the greatest, one of the 5 greatest acts of social intervention and social policy in the world, is to change the relationship between stock and flow. It fundamentally changed the nature of American universities to produce a continuous flow on an ongoing basis that then could lead and manage the economy and the polity. In other places, by contrast, we find very narrow kinds of linkages. The next level is to look at the network. Because again, if you're looking a lot of, as it works in developing countries, the concentration is on the capital. The more things are concentrated on a capital, the more there are problems with competitiveness in a country. So immediately, if one takes key cities of a country and sees what is the nature of cluster presence, and then coordination among these presence, one gets a spatial view of the economy. The economy, in other words, I'm arguing, is a network that binds people together. The same way that political parties are a network that bind people ideologically together, economic networks produce cross-cutting ties. In societies that identities are multiple, the extent to which cross-cutting ties are developed are critical for stability and for ability to coordinate. But again, in most countries, when you go to network level, there's another significant decline. Then, national level competitiveness. Because at the national level, you cannot produce national competitiveness through the economy alone. You need, by definition, the political class on board and a pact between the political and economic elites to be able to function and to focus. future planning was invented not incidentally by an ophthalmologist. 2020, the plan that Malaysia first formulated and has now become an industry, was done by Dr. Mahathir because he wanted 2020 vision. His goal was not the year 2020 initially. But that kind of systematic focus is acquired to project a 10-year or 20-year or 30-year vision, requires a basis of understanding constraints. Let me take one illustration so we can have conversation, because it deals with a number of things. Most ministers of finance in the world, most governments, prime ministers, presidents, chase money. Their first thing is saying, give me money. But the problem, I would argue, is exactly the opposite. 100 countries in the world, in some very significant departments of government in this city, cannot spend money, no matter how much money you give them. It's called the expenditure constraint. Iraq was one of the most severe, could never spend more than 12% of its developmental budget, even on the oil sector. The Department of Energy and the Department of Urban Development in the United States have had severe problems spending money. What's the relationship between the expenditure constraint and the construction industry? The construction industry, both in developing countries and very advanced countries, constitutes between 5 to 15% of the economy. And it's totally understudied. We're producing a manual, again, at IC, so we're looking at global patterns. In the next 25 years, $30 to $65 billion are going to be invested in infrastructure. The construction industry has a couple of characteristics. One, it beats even the arms industry in corruption around the world. Two, government is involved in it. It's distinctive compared to other industries because government demand across the world constitutes a very significant part of its business. But three, if you don't have a functioning construction industry, you cannot spend money. There's one-to-one correlation. Singapore's story of success actually begins with the story of building its construction industry. Now, the Washington Consensus around 19th Street, where I used to work, and across Pennsylvania, where I used to work, is about working through contractors. Nowhere in the world is if contractors produce rates of growth. The subcontracting arrangement diminishes the value of the dollar to 15 cents, 20 cents, etc. So working, if one wants, this is what I'm using as an illustration to allow. If we want to get cost-effective development, we need to be able to focus on the construction industry as a network. The United States has fantastic capabilities in this regard that could help other countries and actually end up creating jobs. But it requires very different kinds of networks. It is not arguing for isolation. It's on the contrary, arguing for effectiveness. Because it's a continuous process. And to give two illustrations again. Our preliminary analysis is that if we really focused on the construction industry as a global economic driver, the cost of infrastructure could be cut by half. In case of a country like Afghanistan, I've calculated we can bring down the cost by 440% within 2 years. Currently, the average price of a kilometer of road is $850,000, the outlying being $2 million per kilometer. Minimally, we need 40,000 kilometers of roads. That translates to $34 billion. Nobody is going to give us, and otherwise we'll have to spend all our money from our mineral sector on building roads. But delivering it on 200,000 is totally feasible. But it requires a very different way. Because this is where I want to get to rule of law. We've approached rule of law in the aid industry as a formal process. So when you get to procurement, procurement is turned into technical experts. Because it really is the expertise largely of engineers or former engineers with some business managers. But if one wants to overcome the expenditure constraint, it has to be built back into the politics of consensus regarding economic dimensions in creating stakeholders. So the notion that I want to put to you is to treat rules as resources. What does this mean? I'll give you one illustration. Afghanistan has just exceeded having 18 million phones. They have over 90% rate of penetration. The cost to an average customer is come down from $12 per person to $1.6 per person. Because there are 4 companies that are competing. A series of very simple rules enable this phenomenon. What? Awarding contracts to 2 firms for 3 years, then awarding contracts to other firms for 3 years on a total level playing field. Total technical review of the capabilities and lack of interference. The first fee for the license was $5 million, the royal sum of $5 million. And the estimation was by the company Roshan, that now is worth over $1 billion, that the total market in Afghanistan would be worth 400,000 phones. Within 4 months, their projections were exceeded. So, but when you don't, why simple rules? Because if rules become too complicated, they acquire management. They acquire supervision, they acquire dispute resolution, and that kind of sophisticated machinery is not there in these countries. Now, at the most advanced corporations, the fastest parts of the industry operate with simple rules, a strategy, because context changes rapidly. But the developmental strategy is a product of an era of business where the hierarchical cooperation dominated. It's a heritage of military planning transferred to the economy and to the bureaucracy. This type of rules, because what the government has the ability is to form the rules of the game. That is the most distinctive part of the government. But the government does not have the knowledge or the capability. So multi-stakeholder coalitions become really important to the formulation and enforcement of the games. It's not that you don't need rule of law. Rule of law is absolutely desirable in the glue. But the process that we are proposing is to build a stew that is thickened. One is not going to go to rule of law at one go. But because we either say we have it all or we have nothing, we allow for grand corruption. And here, private-public partnerships have become the norm. There's a lot of thinking about it. But I think that private-public partnerships need to become a compact first, rather than just partnerships. Spain of 1975 is an example of private-public compact first. The democratic process and the economic process came together to reinforce the goal of joining Europe. If there is a compact, predictability comes through the set of rules that are reinforced. Why is this necessary? Because a lot of countries in the world today can dispense with foreign aid quite easily if they could harness their domestic capital. Afghanistan, for instance, is awash in money. Our first priority, Ambassador Khalsa and I have talked a lot about this, is to make sure that Afghan capital does not leave the country. The minute that is done, stabilization effects take place because it's a chain relationship. Because of this, we would propose that constraints to a market building strategy need to come to the agenda of places like NED in a structured manner. Not export of specific tools, but a systematic analysis of the type of constraints that prevent a functioning market that then is measured and reflected in national accounts. In here, this city and this country is enormous things to offer. OPEC, the Overseas Private Sector Investment Corporation. When I became finance minister, I came to Washington first and asked the US bureaucracy to ask OPEC to go to Afghanistan. They threw me out of the room. But again, Ambassador Khaizad and I joined forces and asked President Bush directly for an ask. He ordered them. They provided $1 billion in guarantees. By 1910, only $10,000 were recorded. The experiment was so successful that they made it into a post-conflict facility. Now it's covering about 6 countries. Exim Bank loan guarantees. We need to think in an environment of fiscal constraints in developed countries about different instruments. As I've said, today I don't want to engage in criticism of USAID or any of my other interlocutors. That is the positive agenda. The positive agenda is going to be about a new imagination of financial instruments. Because what is it that these financial instruments do? They measure, they assess risk, they measure risk, they quantify risk, and then they put a premium on it. Lloyd's even guaranteed a coup once. It ensured a coup. At least that's the folklore. So it can be done. And this means outcomes need to be agreed upon and processes need to be discussed. And that brings me to the fundamental argument back with which I began. Economy, governance, and security are 3 legs of a stability agenda. When one leg of the stool takes the burden, it cannot bear the weight. So if you want to avoid huge security expenditures, we need to be able to invest back in the other 2. Let me very quickly conclude with some of the lessons that we've derived from our case studies. Our first lesson, as I articulated already, is the centrality of consensus building in managing change. Change, by definition, is unsettling. So there are 2 reactions to it. Either resistance or creating the welcome environment. What we are arguing is that the pace of change itself needs to be subject to consensus in repeated confirmations so as not to bring ruptures. Sustainability of reforms requires that the payoff from reforms and the pains of reforms are carefully balanced. There's no reform that is not painful to a constituency. The key is how one does balance it in terms of societal net account. The second issue is leadership and management. Leadership and management need to be distinguished and defined. At times, consensus building is 90% leadership and 10% management. But sustaining consensus is 90% management and 10% leadership. Because politics is an eternal process. People can change their minds. Until credible institutions are built, this balance between managing and leading is extremely important. Third is utilization of existing assets. It's amazing as to how many assets in a country remain latent till somebody brings them to the fore. But most of the times, the approach internationally adopted is to look as to what does not exist. It's called needs assessment. And when you're dealing with a transition country where deprivation has been the rule, for instance, in Eastern Europe, that Anne is so well documented, getting eggs for Christmas cake was an enormous endeavor. People had to stand in line, and then they would be given 2 or 3, recipe, etc. Shift from that kind of environment. If you ask people what they need, they give you the American middle class dream. Everybody wants to become Denmark tomorrow. But an asset-focused approach allows utilization of existing assets. In Russia, for instance, I was asked to make sure that the Russian miners got paid on full and on time, something that had never happened in Russian history. I did it with 3 people, all Russians. And within 6 months, we figured the system, because it's a strategy of knitting together, lacing together existing components that exist, but bringing them together. When Putin became prime minister, he asked, why is it that people in the coal industry are paying? You say, we wouldn't believe it. There's a crazy Afghan. Well, you know, Russia was a test for me whether I'd really be an international servant. Hopefully I survived. But existing assets becomes extremely important, because then a sense of inferiority is not produced. And in most of the countries when we go, you know, I've been 10 years at the World Bank, so I can use the word go, one focuses on telling them what they don't understand. But rarely do we focus on working with them to move the existing assets to a different set of configuration. For instance, just give you an example on Syria. Dr. Riyad Saadi, my brother-in-law, has written a paper on agriculture. Syrian agriculture, unlike Egyptian agriculture, has been a story of success. There's phenomenal private sector investment in the last 10 years, and before that, public sector investment. But this year, Syria faces the risk of a major famine. Now, you have 2 ways of approaching this. Again, bring WFP and all the traditional instruments and deliver food, or negotiate a humanitarian space to allow the cultivation of the 2013 and 2014 crops to take place. The capabilities exist, but do we utilize them? The other part is building systems. When transition becomes transformation, the hallmark is building of systems. And again, you know, we're in a very ironic position vis-a-vis economic development management and leadership. We don't document our successes. Political science has gone to study rational actor behavior and has developed an enormous envy vis-a-vis economics. And economics, of course, you know, has the old joke. You remember how many economists takes to change a light bulb? None, because the market will take care of it. So we need to bring a system perspective, but the system issue is that systems are not created overnight. We need to have the patience to be able to build systems systemically. And once those are built, there's been incredible innovation in this regard. But the practice of economic and political management is far richer, fortunately, than its theory. And again, we have documented a lot. The other is citizenship back to democracy is produced through delivery. Credible delivery becomes the heart of legitimacy. When citizens are told that delivery can take place according to the means and prioritization, and that their energies are required to produce this, it reinforces notions of citizenship. And here again, we came with the notions of national programs, which means a comprehensive set of treatment of all citizens on a level playing field. The other part that I've already highlighted are economic pacts. If you look at the private sector, Spain has a lot of economic difficulties today. But if you look at auctioning of procurement of infrastructure in the United States, left and right Spanish firms are winning the contract. The Chicago Skyway, Texas, West Virginia, and others. These were product of a particular economic compact because Spain's government couldn't pay in the 70s for infrastructure. So I entered into long-term agreements. And that has produced some of the world's top economic performers in that regard. And the other issue is managing regional and international relationships. Because no country exists in an isolated time. There's a global time and there's a regional time. And these two have serious implications for managing of economic understandings. The region, again, I would like to bring to your attention, is often a null unit of economic thinking. A lot of international organizations are categorized in terms of regions, East Asia, South Asia, Latin America, etc. But the unit is actually project and country. It's not regional thinking. And the regional environment is either an immense constraint or an immense opportunity. To just think about one region of the world, which is going to be looming enormously, Asia is still a concept. But in the next 25 years, it is very likely that Asia will become a continental economy. The end, if one could envisage the end of a 500 years of violent conflict in Asia, as most of the 20th century's conflicts have been in Asia, one could imagine the type of possibilities that then opens up, but also the type of challenges and risks that emerge from this. So promotion of regional cooperative arrangements becomes another key issue in this agenda. Studies have shown that when a country goes from conflict to peace, it could have as much as 2% contribution to the neighboring countries' economies, positive rate of growth. So there are enormous synergies that can be. At IC, we have done a lot of repertoires, and it's part of what we're continuing to do. Let me again restate. The stool with 3 legs of governance, economic, and security must be embedded within political consensus. Politics matters, and particularly in this environment where political consensus is hard to reach, it's all the more imperative that we think about political embeddedness. 2, we need to shift from foregrounding of security to foregrounding of governance and economics. The major achievement of democracy, as Amartya Sen noted, is the 2 democracies have not yet gone to war. But it's not only that. Security is put in the background. No democracy in the 21st century is likely to use force against its own citizens. The threat of use of force, the problem of use of force has been turned into a problem of law and order, not a problem of regimes being held by bandits. And that, again, is a validation. In here, a lot of organizations, of course, claim that they do economics. But the test must be, can they bear the weight? And I think the word development should be banned for a decade so that we don't keep re-invoking the old and tired habits of the past. We need a breakthrough. The word is on the one hand an enormous set of opportunities for us, and on the other hand, an enormous set of challenges. The billions of young people, some of whom produced the dynamic of the Arab Spring, are still excluded. They could disrupt our world of comfort very badly if we don't turn them into stakeholders. The message of hope is that if 4 billion people are without property, endowing them back with property rights, which is not really rocket science, or making sure that we focus on the use of resources as true mechanisms of bringing women, youth, and the poor into the mainstream would have an immense contribution to stability in our world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a lot to think about in that lecture. I'll let the technicians come and do a brief interruption. I will probably take the opportunity of asking the first question, and then we have such a distinguished audience that I won't conduct the customary conversation with Dr. Ghani. I will instead pull you all in right away, because people are already waving their hands at me, and I haven't even started talking yet. I was just going to ask, one of the things I find and I found this when we were working on the Syria paper, people keep asking me for positive examples. You know, people have heard the negative stories. We know how badly Syria can end because we all remember Lebanon. You know, can you, from the work that you and Claire have done, can you point to, you mentioned a few, you know, the issues that we need to work on. You spoke about consensus building. You spoke about utilization of existing assets. You spoke about building of systems and actually used the example of the Spanish construction industry. Can you point us to recent conflicts or recent, in the last 20 years, conflict where one or two of these issues have been resolved well? What are the positive examples, and are those, you know, I mean, I have Syria in the front of my brain at the moment, but you know, you may have other places in the world you could apply them to. Are there examples we can bring from the past into the present right now on those particular topics to use?
Well, you take Chile. Chile was devastated. First by Andes coming to power because of the disruptions, and then his overthrow. But if one looks into the pathway of transformation of Chile from 1980s to the 2000s, it's a remarkable story of all the elements that we've described.
Can you focus on one or two of them?
An agreement between the private sector and the public sector to produce value for the country as a whole. It's one of the most sustained stories of growth. Management and leadership. Now Chile has a system of measurement of its government inputs in economic management that's among the most sophisticated. Immense positive utilization of foreign aid. Because there were sanctions against Pinochet regime, they were forced to look inside and utilize their existing assets. Consensus. You want to look at another story, look at Finland after World War I. The communists lost power in the Civil War. But the agenda that was struck was a balance between social rights and economic freedoms. Finland is a coalition government in the process of 90 years. It went from one of the poorest countries in Europe to one of the richest, topping everything. But what is the nature of the compact that is so different in Finland? Because today, most of the peace agreements that are mediated between UN and others is an elite compact. In Finland, you actually acquired a compact to allow for a technical sphere of governance to develop and be governed increasingly by rule of law then exemplified. Now Finland tops every index on transparency, on accountability, on competitiveness.
And how did is it just because Finland is a homogenous country?
Because they
what
were
was
divided.
the process?
No, they were divided. They were literally people. So the two sides ideologically were so divided that they'd killed each other. And this is why we are looking at that sort of story. Rwanda, after the genocide that it experienced, has really managed to move from hell. Rwanda is far from a complete story. But the story of shift from, you compare Rwanda with its neighbors. Now it's become an anchor. Just take the story of Rwanda's coffee. Burundi, the neighboring country, has still not reorganized, even taken the initial steps to reorganize its coffee industry. It's one of the most tasty coffees in the world. Rwanda's coffee is sold on Alitalia. It has the best set of value chains that have come together. So, range of time. If you go to India, we've looked at 4 states in India. Bihar. If Bihar were a country, it's huge population, tens of millions. It had reached a point where they called it the rule of thugs, Gundaraj. Bihar in the last 10 years is fundamentally shifted to solve the pervasive problem of criminality, where gangs were threatening, to a rule of law agenda. Karnataka went through the same phase from being very marginal, and it acquired the economic dynamism of developing clusters in Bangalore. But Karnataka, by contrast, now, in the second generation, is facing immense problems of corruption. So part of the story is what we're suggesting is we need to have a repertoire of problem definition in a range of ways in which these were solved in distinctive countries. So that then when you put an approach for Syria, it cannot be the replication of one place because the elements need to meet context. But a range of these would allow for a very different type of approach than just replication. Because Syria, for instance, look at its assets. Little known, fertilizer is forbidden in Syria. So almost every crop in Syria is grown organically. It went from producing about 7,000 tons of citrus to last year 1.7 million tons of citrus. If that were connected to the organic value chain, you could offer Syria a very different type of citrus possibilities. But one has to know the place of organic, the place of marketing, and allow for that type of thing. Syria cannot spend money. If one looks at the Syrian budget system, it's been arbitrary. It's over the last 10 years, 20 years particularly. They cut it totally through an arbitrary phenomena, they increase it through an arbitrary phenomena. Now, making the budget predictable is going to be one of the most critical issues of bringing stability to Syria. Level at which services are delivered. In an authoritarian system, municipalities have no existence, or they're totally atrophied from initiative. Clarifying certain levels of authority. One of the most important task forces that took place in the United States was the 1962 task force on defining functions in levels of government. It's a remarkable, I've seen very little work like this. That's the type of work that is going to have immense implications for how Syria is put together. What functions must be performed by municipalities, which by provinces, districts, so that one can harness these tendencies together.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Khalilzad, would you like to make the first comment or question to your former classmate?
Sure.
I'm still his classmate. I cannot be former.
Well, a great pleasure to listen to you, Ashraf. I wanted to ask somebody like myself who was sent somewhere like Afghanistan and Iraq. You have a roadmap that generally are given based on the agreement as to what the political steps have to be taken to lead towards stability or progress. You generally have, whether good or bad, a military plan that needs to go forward. You've made the case for the importance of economics. And I remember asking in each of the jobs that I've Iraq and Afghanistan, what is our economic theory for making the country work economically? And your list of things that need to be done seem all quite good, obviously, important. But the question really that occurs to me as a practitioner, are they all equally important? Or should there be sequencing that some things have to come first? Because you can't do perhaps all of them equally well at the same time, or maybe some things have to be done before some other things can get done. Or are there things that have to be done even before you get to some of what you think are important to be done? As you know, for example, in the case of Afghanistan, we were together. Some of the key issues was, how do you get to a single currency? How do you destroy the existing currencies? And you led a great effort to produce a single currency. There's the issue of customs. How do you collect revenue? That's so important. How do you use politics and coercion to collect revenue from the people controlling the border? And then there is the imperative of we must build roads. The roads have to be fixed. Politics intervenes. Even if you had a theory of what you would do, how you would do it in an ideal world, what should come first. So I would like to get your sense of, is there a sequencing? Is there a prioritization? What comes first? What comes second?
No, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for a brilliant question, as usual. First issue is understanding of constraints. Because sequence is the heart of success in political transformation, in economic transformation. This is not an agenda that can be done at one go simultaneously. So it is imperative. Because of that, the reason I was highlighting the construction industry, for instance, is that in terms of removing the problem of spending effectively, that is a driver. Because it's cross-cutting. If you're building, as you witnessed in Afghanistan, initially, when I was at the finance ministry, we were delivering at $150,000 per kilometer. It kept escalating because there wasn't a system approach to it. And that has consequences. So that's one issue. Sequence is a must, and prioritization is to be on those aspects that form cross-cutting impacts. Two, there are issues that, if not addressed, immediately acquire long-term implications that then are extremely difficult to reverse. For instance, the urban sector. In almost every post-conflict environment, price of property in urban areas, price of housing, has gone through the roof. Now, most developmental organizations actually don't know how to do proper housing. And instead, slum development comes. Because of this, what I propose in terms of prioritization is how can we prevent the known syndromes of criminality and informality? Then a set of interventions. At that time, I didn't know enough to be able to do that. Now I've spent 10 years, and I think both Hernando de Soto's extremely important work and what we've done subsequently to operationalize it would allow us to harness urban development in a very different way. Three is what is really essential about system building. Because a payroll, as you saw, or change, because here is the question of knowledge. First, to illustrate what Dr. Khalilzad was saying. I had done the economic side of the large-scale projects and changes, but I had not done currency because I'd never served in the IMF. So when we went back to Afghanistan, it was the situation like post-war Germany. A basket of currency was required to buy a couple of items of goods. So I asked the IMF and said, what's your recommendation? They said, you cannot change the currency in less than 2 years with under $100 million expenditure with less than 8,000 bureaucrats. And so I said, what gives? And they said, change to the dollar. Then 2 years later, you change back. President Karzai had enormously good political instincts. So for 1 week, we focused, and Ambassador Khalilzad was in those discussions. He kept asking one question. How would you explain it to the Afghan people? At the end, we said, you've asked the right question, we can't explain it. I changed the currency in 4 months with no bureaucracy, with under 20 million. And our biggest problem was burning the whole damn thing because we'd collected 16 tons of currency. Why? Because we used a network that had never been taught by IMF to be positive. It was the Hawala network. I called the Hawala dealers and made a deal with them. And they changed.
Sorry, which networks? The
Hawala.
Hawala.
This is an informal exchange network that has existed in our part of the world for 2,000 years. Its best description is actually provided by Gore Vidal in his novel called Creation, which is about ancient Persia, China, and India. I'd studied these as part of the economic history. And they had the networks. No disruptions. Now, the system-building approach, for instance, the essential thing of authority of the state and credibility in it is in a payroll. You have to be able to pay people. And it's so one can itemize those priority lists, but again, in full agreement with you and what I was articulating earlier, changing a dysfunctional ministry to a fully functioning ministry is a work of 10 years. And it has to be built sequentially. If you tackle too many things at one go, you will create a very strong coalition of negative interests. So the political economy judgment is essential. That the payoff from reforms is significant to the society, that it welcomes the next phase, and that one has tested this credibility. It's this balancing act, and it always requires judgment.
Another question or comment? There's one in the very back of the room.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for the informative talk today.
And could you introduce yourself? Sir?
My name is Suleiman Nasri. I'm a graduate student in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Thank you for being here. Dr. Ghani, I have 2 questions. My first question is with regards to opium production and poppy cultivation in Afghanistan. It seems that it's a huge part of the Afghan economy, but there is no revenue that goes to the Afghan government. It actually funds the insurgency in Afghanistan. So I was wondering if the Afghan government can learn anything from Turkey in 1970s and or earlier on, I think, with regards to legalization of opium in Afghanistan, that there is strict restriction where the revenue goes to the Afghan government. My second question is with regards to brain drain, or the Afghan expatriates who are living or studying actually in other parts of the world, especially in the Western world. What can the Afghan government do in order to attract some of these human capital in order to use them for the betterment of the country? Thank you.
Thank you. Should I answer one by one? How do you want?
Do you want to? We can take one other one, if
Yeah.
maybe from here. Yes. Microphone.
You can speak loudly.
I think they want it to be recorded, though.
Thank you, Dr. Ghani, for your presentation. My name is Rich Kramer. I work here at the National Endowment for Grantees in Afghanistan and Iran. This is a question about Afghanistan, but I think it can apply to other states as well, so maybe we can open it up some.
Don't feel shy. I don't mind answering questions on Afghanistan, provided
All right. Well,
they are within certain limits.
Within certain limits, indeed. So over the past 10 years, we've seen the phenomenon of urbanization in Afghanistan to an immense degree. When I lived there several years ago, we had about 2.5 million people, maybe in the capital. Now we're around 5 million. And we've seen that in other cities. So your discussion today, particularly regarding entrepreneurship and kind of value added as you go up from the individual to the national level, and also in your remarks on rule of law, I'm wondering to the extent to which urbanization as a phenomenon in Afghanistan actually is a positive indicator. It helps sets the environment whereby these conditions may be more easily met. Is that a significant factor? And then if so, what would be the role of both government at a national, local level, as well as civil society, and maybe help being able to cultivate the best benefits they can out of that new environment? Thank you.
You want to take those two, and then we'll
Sure,
take another.
Sure, since these were Afghans. And let me take them in reverse order. Herat is a remarkable example of citizenship action in practice. Every street in Herat has been widened 2 to 5 meters. Urban resettlement, I was in charge of this at the World Bank for 5 years, is one of the most difficult. Bombay is totally stuck. As in China, most of the protests are about resettlement. 40,000 protests a year. But in Herat, people voluntarily shifted the streets. Now they're paving the streets with their own contributions. That's a positive example. Mazar, we have one of the most remarkable private-public sector sets of interactions to create housing. There's a lot of corruption in it, but that is like American municipalities in the United States have never overcome corruption. There's still very, very significant residues. Somebody who lived in Baltimore for 13 years understands this, as well as other places. But they've produced. Compare, if you take the stock of public and private built environment in Mazar, it's remarkable. And it's produced through this harnessing. The private sector is cleaning all public streets. Kabul, by contrast, is a dismal failure. 85% of Kabul today is informal. So at least $10 to $15 billion of investment has taken place, but it has not gone anywhere to create an enduring livable capital. That's one side. So now on the implications of, first, urbanization in Afghanistan is not based on the cities doing anything for the countryside. Because when you have a very strong import economy, the countryside is not receiving services from the city. The risk of de-urbanization in Afghanistan of post-2014 is quite considerable. What would they live on? Once ISAF, every 10,000 ISAF troops that are withdrawn, with it goes a segment of the urban economy. 3, price of housing, price of transport, price of labor in Afghan cities is among the most expensive. An Afghan who's been a graduate of a Pakistani or Indian university is paid 5 to 20 times in dollars what his counterpart in India or Pakistan receives in rupees. This is not a recipe for competitiveness. So first issues, property rights need to be regularized. I think we can do this within 2 years flat if we really put our heads to it. Because housing has to become affordable. The heart of Singapore's strategy of development was affordable housing. That, and again, in Kabul there are neighborhoods where now 45% of the infrastructure is being paid by the neighbors. Small in number, but quite effective. 2, municipal financing has to be put on a sound footing. You cannot over-concentrate authority and deprive cities of their growth. 3, the value proposition of what the cities produce for the rest of the country has to be put up front. And this means, for instance, if you had 60% of our agricultural produce rots between the farm and the market, a substantial part of our fruits and our vegetables, like onions, go to Pakistan or stored, sold back to us at 4 to 6 times the price in the spring or winter. You need to connect. If you had a chain of 200 supermarkets that stabilized the relations between urban and rural, urban demand could lift rural income 2 to 4 times. And in return. So in other words, development of food industry really becomes critical to this, of providing a set of linkages. If we don't handle that, our cities in the past had a radius of 60 miles that were organically linked to the cities. All the key elites and the bureaucracy came from those types of neighborhoods. Today, the greatest infrastructure of insurgency is in the peri-urban environment, because the peri-urban environment has not been transformed. So we need to think through spatially. One thing that is missing in developmental thinking continuously is the spatial dimension. In Afghanistan, we have to deliver economic growth from 300 meters above sea level to 4,500 meters above sea level. This is an immense set of issues that we need to confront. You very kind question, the twofold questions. First, on legalization of opium. It's not just in Turkey. India produces it, Australia produces, thank you, and France produces it legally. But the regime is very strict. It requires a level of management of that facilities that is potentially achievable, but not. But the more fundamental question that you're raising is the hypocrisy. Heroin is the addiction of the Western middle class. Legalize it, tomorrow Afghanistan's competitiveness disappears. We don't have any competitiveness in this regard compared to Spain or Portugal or others, or to California. They will grow it. But the politics is one of hypocrisy, because Western political leaders are not willing to confront their own middle class and intellectuals' habits. And an elimination of this. So what we've gotten is a mixed bag. The illegal global economy, $1.7 trillion a year. Helmand alone will be among the 10 top contributors to this. We are getting the worst of both worlds. The criminal networks are completely linked to this globalized network. Legal agriculture, for instance, Helmand right now is 40,000 tons of cotton in the warehouses of the farmers. Old textile mills are not being renewed. The new outlets are not found. We need to be able to think about economics. So the other lesson of Turkey is, again, of course, a dynamic competitive economy, because criminalization disappeared when you acquired the type of approach that I laid out. In terms of the Afghan considerable diaspora, this is an immense asset. You know, we are a diaspora nation because we have 5 million people among our neighbors. The 4 generations that coexist in Afghanistan today, almost every one of them is experienced exile or internal displacement. And the third generation of Afghans that are coming to maturity in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, are an immense asset. And if you look into the experience of places like Ireland, Poland more recently, India, this generation is contributed immensely to economic change. The problem of government not utilizing this is one of grand corruption. Because as long as you have a system of recruitment by patronage, it undermines merit. And that's the problem that we need to confront, because Afghanistan's tragedy today is not one of capacity. The capacity exists. We have 30,000 people in the civil society sector alone that could deliver a developmental program to any village in Afghanistan regarding of status of security within 6 weeks flat. The problem is one of political will to mobilize the capability. The wrong people are in the wrong places. Those who have the capability are outside the country or marginalized. Those who do not have the capability are in positions of power. And our national discussion of next year should be precisely about how to bring a consensus. When I'm talking about a consensus, I'm not talking just about consensus abstractly. I want to, in Afghanistan, advocate a national dialogue where all stakeholders really can come together and learn. Thus, either we collectively sink or we are able to really go to a safe shore. And thank you again.
Thank you. I would say the interesting thing about diasporas is there are countries which have used them well and there are countries which have not. And you can even go through the list of Eastern European countries and point to the ones which have made clever use of them and those that haven't. So it's absolutely, you're right, that it's a central piece of policy. Can I take a couple of more questions? It's gotten slightly late, so we'll just do a couple more now and then break up. One there, and then we'll do one more.
Hi, thank you. Zach Gold from the Brookings Institution. I appreciate your presentation, and I know that there was a wide swath of lessons learned from all sorts of previous transitions. I was wondering if you could specifically look at, I guess, what the U.S. and Europe did correctly or incorrectly, either to stabilize Western Europe after World War II or to stabilize Eastern Europe after the Cold War, and how that can be done, looking specifically at, I suppose, the Arab states today. Thank you.
Thank you.
A very small question,
Very
very
small
narrow.
questions
Yes. Would anyone else like to add one more
I
before,
think after a question like
before
that,
Dr. Ghani speaks for the next hour and 45 minutes? No? Okay, why don't we let you conclude on that in that case?
First, the genius of the Marshall Plan. You know, there were 4 designs for the Marshall Plan. The 3 that were rejected to a T resemble the current operation of USAID and the World Bank. Those wise people had the genius to think through system level. So it's not the amount. The amount of Marshall aid assistance, Iraq and Afghanistan, have exceeded that amount. It's a very, very sad fact that in each of these countries, the United States has spent more than it spent on Marshall Plan and contemporary dollar. It was the design. The design focused on systems and brought about a set of major political, economic alignments that became transformative. And there, again, it's the impact of the network. Acheson, Schuman, Monet, Adenauer knew each other intimately. And Bevan again. Well, I mean, the Marshall Plan, if you read the section on Acheson, on how, because Marshall Plan is really, I mean, you know, there's this misnomer. Eisenhower won all the plaudits for the war that Marshall really conducted and won, but out of loyalty to Roosevelt, refused to lead. And then the Marshall Plan is really the Acheson Plan. Acheson prepared it, but Marshall gave the speech. And I actually saw the room in the Blair House where he presented it. It's a remarkable act of transformation. Equivalent, the same time, if you look at it to the GI Bill of Rights domestically. If we come to Eastern Europe, Russia is a dismal failure. Now again, for instance, in 96, they had 100 economists working on Russia. They didn't understand that there was a treasury system. Till I discovered it for them and brought it forward. Russia was a failure of imagination at every level. For the first time in 400 years of its history, Russia was really ready for a democratic experiment and a commitment. But we collectively, all of us, failed them. You know, they were literally begging. You know, Russia is extremely cold, and they have a unique phenomenon called winterization. I've been at Russian houses in Siberia and elsewhere at midnight in 96, 97, 98, where people had to sleep with their overcoats because 60% of the power would not come. Just getting power right in Russia, 60% of it was disappearing, but there was no imagination. European Union, particularly, was a miserable failure because they couldn't dispense any money. You know, at the World Bank, I was managing this program, which was $2 billion, and we stretched it over 5 years and really succeeded in getting funds. So Russia, I think, is failure of imagination. Eastern Europe, the key issue of success in Eastern Europe is the process of accession. because there's a destination. And there, the key was learning from accession of Spain, which was kept away in very stringent set of conditions. The story of Eastern Europe is a mixed one in terms of the accession process, because one part of it was that it provided a destination, but another part of it was that the second wave of accession, I think, was done too quickly and on political grounds for places like Bulgaria and Romania and others. So what we are seeing is re-emergence of corruption and cronyism to a level that the European accession process should have prevented. And when we get to Kosovo, I mean, it really shows the limitation of Europe. And Kosovo was the last act of the long European civil war that Acheson again so well described. But the mandate arrangement that was put by the UN in Kosovo was a miserable failure. Four contradictories. In Kosovo, you had this situation where you literally could not understand what was the operating law of the land. They were in four different languages, four different systems, and never coordinated. For the Arab Spring, a series of lessons comes. One is that instruments need to be thought through in a very different way. If you operate through the Beltway, you are going to generate enormous resentment against the United States. Because a dollar delivered through the Beltway ends up being 15 cents on the ground. And that's a calculus that the U.S. policymakers, particularly at this age, and you and Brookings and other colleagues, need to really think through. Do you want sustainment of the security development complex, or do you want stability in the Arab world? It's a decision that needs to be weighed very carefully. Between the will of the American public and the American government stands a privatized set of entities that are driven by predatory quest for profit. I have nothing against profit. I believe in functioning market. But this is predatory. And it needs to be touched. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson is rethink Exim Bank OPEC guarantees. Because that set of instruments needs to be put together through a different set of possibilities. In here, what is critical is business for national security. That group of American corporations that think through two lenses, both profit and security, need to be engaged. Because if aid is to be restructured in the United States without having other stakeholders enter into this, it's not going to happen. Fourth would be the human capital part. My college roommate, another Afghan, is the president of San Jose University. He has just launched an event that is going to change the nature of education globally. Claire, is it $250? Most $150 per course. The old way of delivering human capital, given visa regimes, given other things, is really difficult. So part of the thing that you have are two assets. One would be to utilize this enormous network that has been created in the Gulf of higher education. New York, Columbia, Cornell, who's not there? To be reused for a much broader population. The American University of Beirut, where Zal and I went, USAID, in its glory days, used to subsidize 1,600 students a year. We were all on that project. A different type of network of instruments would be important. And then it's really technical assistance needs to change from being a profit-driven, unaccountable device to becoming strategic. Avoid, deploying one civilian to Afghanistan costs $550,000 a year. Deploying one soldier in Afghanistan costs $1 million a year. Quantity and quality should not be confused. Marshall Plan was implemented, conceived and implemented and managed by less than 100 people. So high-level strategic focus, I think, would be a lot more significant. And lastly, facilitate the Mediterranean Initiative. That ties between Europe, the two sides of the Mediterranean, that if really not developed, would become essential for places like Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria. And I said last but one footnote to that, the places are very different. Tunisia is an upper middle income country where the experience that becomes relevant to it is Spain and Portugal. Libya is a very different type of configuration. So between the wider and the country specifics, a balance needs to be struck. Libya, for instance, $140 billion in this country. $140 billion in cash in this country. And wisely, they've said, don't give it back to us. Because if they were to spend $140 billion without the sort of institutions, it would create a huge set of things. Egypt, by contrast, needs help, and if typical IMF conditionality is imposed on Egypt, the political and economic consequences of dislocation need to be thought through. So the balance between building system accountability and ensuring what Zal Khalizad was asking, that the sequence is right.
We said we would end at 2 o'clock, and on that, following that oration, I think we will draw this to a close. Thank you all very, very much for coming. We appreciate your patience, and thank you very much, Dr. Ghani, for your contribution.